the missing string that ended his season, walked home behind a quiet woman. The fiddle string broke on a Tuesday in late September, and I didn't fix it. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not the frost that came too early and killed the last of the alfalfa. Not the calf that died in the creek crossing and pulled my best rope into the current with her. Not even the morning I woke up in the bunkhouse instead of the house because I'd stopped sleeping in the house by then and hadn't noticed until a full month had passed. The fiddle string is the thing that stays with me. E string, the high one. Snapped when I was tuning, made that little flat pop like a cap gun, and I set the fiddle on the workbench and walked outside and didn't pick it up again. That was the end of something. I just didn't know the name of it yet. My name is Callum Reese, and I ran cattle on the North Fork of the Powder River for 22 years. Still do, I suppose, though there's a different quality to the running now. In those days, the fall I'm talking about, the ranch was down to me and two part-time hands named Ollie and a boy they all called Sug, and a house that had 3 rooms shut up tight with the curtains drawn. You know what I mean when I say that. You don't have to be told what was in those rooms. My wife Dora had been gone 4 years. My daughter Ellen gone 3. I don't say that to gather sympathy. I say it because it explains the fiddle. A man can lose his wife and keep moving. It hurts in a way that is almost clean if you hold it right, like a brake that's set straight. You learn to walk with the ache. You get up in the morning and the coffee is wrong because she always made the coffee, and you make it thinner or stronger or differently every time, and you never quite find the right amount. And that's the loss of her in the coffee, in the left side of the bed, in the absence of her voice calling from the other room. It's everywhere, but it's manageable. You can see the shape of it and move around it. What happened to Ellen was not like that. That was the kind of thing that doesn't set. It moves around inside you, finds new rooms, sits in the corner of every ordinary minute. And there's no clean grief for it because grief wants an ending, and that kind of loss doesn't end. It just changes shape and follows you into sleep and into work, and into every quiet moment where you might have once picked up a fiddle. You are cutting ice from the water tank at 6 in the morning, and the cold burns your hands and you think of her. You are eating supper alone and you think of her. You are riding the south fence at dusk, with the light going sideways through the grass and you think of her, and the thinking is not remembering, not the good kind. It's more like pressing on a wound to check that it's still there and finding out that it always is. 4 years after Dora, 3 years after Ellen, and I was still standing, working, eating when I remembered, paying Ollie and Sug on time. The cattle were fed and moved and counted and sold at the right weight and at a fair price, and none of it meant a damn thing to me. That's what I mean by the missing string. Not the broken one on the bench, the one in me that had already gone. The Hennessy place sat about 6 miles east of mine along the same fence line. Old Abel Hennessy had worked it for 30 years and then died the February before, and his widow had come out from St. Louis in April to settle the estate. Nobody thought she'd stay. The land agent, Burfield, told me confidently in May that she'd be gone by summer. He said she was a city woman, a school teacher or some such, and this was no country for a woman alone and she'd know it soon enough. I said I supposed so. By August I'd heard she was still there, had put in a small kitchen garden late, was keeping the place tidy and the roof repaired. By September I still hadn't met her. I wasn't avoiding her. I wasn't doing much of anything with intention by September. What happened was the fence. 3 miles of it along our shared line had been put in by Abel and me together back in 1879. Cedar posts we'd cut ourselves and hauled by mule team from the breaks to the north. And it was good fence then, but it was old fence now and something. Maybe an elk herd moving through. Maybe a late summer storm. Maybe just the accumulated weight of 20 years had taken down 100 yards of it along the low stretch near the creek. My cattle were getting into the Hennessy grass, which wasn't grazed and was good and green because she didn't run anything yet, and I needed to fix the fence before the snow came and made the job worse. I went over on a Wednesday morning with a post hole digger, and a spool of wire in the wagon. She was already there. Not at the fence, back from it about 30 yards, sitting on a rock with a cup of something in her hands, watching me come. She didn't wave. I pulled up and climbed down, and she stood and walked over, and I saw she was maybe 45, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, wearing work clothes that fit like she'd worn them before and not as an affectation. Not pretty in the way men mean when they say pretty. She wasn't small or soft, or the kind of woman men notice walking into a room. Something better than that, maybe. A face that had thought things through and come to some conclusions and wasn't apologizing for them. "Mr. Reese," she said. "Mrs. Hennessy." She looked at the fence. I was going to patch it myself, but I didn't have enough wire. "I've got wire," I said. "I can see that." She picked up a pair of fencing pliers from the rock she'd been sitting on. I hadn't noticed them. She'd come to fix the fence. We worked together for about 3 hours. She knew what she was doing, not the way a rancher's wife learns it by watching, but the way somebody learns it by doing, with her hands and her weight in the right places and no wasted motion. She didn't ask me where to stand or what to do next. She read the work and found her place in it. I didn't ask her about it. She didn't explain herself. We just worked the line, set posts, strung wire, stretched it tight, stapled it, moved to the next gap, and by noon we had it done and the cattle wouldn't be getting through. "You want coffee?" she said. I almost said no. I had the wagon turned halfway around already, my hands back in my pockets, already planning the ride home and what would need doing in the afternoon. "All right," I said. We sat on the rock she'd been on earlier, and she poured from a battered pot she'd brought in a cloth sack, and we drank and didn't talk much. She said she was thinking of running sheep. I said sheep were bad for fences. She said she was aware of that. I said I was just mentioning it. She said she'd noted my mentioning, and there was a dryness in how she said it that wasn't unfriendly. When I left, I was about 2 miles down the road before I realized I'd been warm the entire morning. Not happy. I don't want to oversell this, but something in me that had been standing in cold water for 3 years had been standing instead in morning sun, and I hadn't noticed it until it was gone again. The way you don't notice warmth until you step back into shadow. I drove back to the ranch and went straight to the bunkhouse and lay down on my bunk and looked at the ceiling for a long time. I ran into her again 3 weeks later at the Garfield store in town. She was buying flour and lamp oil and a paper of needles, and I was buying not much of anything, mostly reasons to be somewhere that wasn't the ranch. She said hello. I said hello. She asked if the fence was holding. I said it was. Then I don't know what made me say what I said next. It wasn't calculated. It arrived in my mouth before I'd thought it. "I've got a load of cedar posts cut, about 40 of them, that I don't have a use for. The rest of your south fence looks like it could use replacing. I'll bring them over if you want them." She looked at me steadily. Not the way women sometimes look at you when they're calculating what you mean, or what you want, or what your offer will cost them. The way a person looks when they're just listening. "That's generous," she said. "They'll rot in the field otherwise." "All right, Saturday if it suits you." It suited me. Saturday I came with the posts in the wagon and we spent the day setting the south line. It was good cold season work, physical and straightforward, and she worked the same as before, steady and unhurried and competent. She brought lunch, biscuits, and cold chicken and coffee again, and we ate at the base of an old cottonwood, and the day was cold enough for frost on the dead grass and warm enough in the sun that you could feel it on the side of your face. There was ice on the shaded side of the creek, and not on the sunny side, and I noticed that, and then noticed I was noticing things, which was not something I'd done much of in 3 years. She talked a little more that day. She'd run a small farm outside St. Louis, she and Abel, before they came west. Before that, she'd been a schoolteacher for 6 years, primary school, children 7 to 12. She'd stopped when her first child came. She said all of this in a practical way, not as autobiography but as conversation, the way you'd tell a person facts about terrain they'd be traveling through. I asked without meaning to, "Where's the child now?" She was quiet for a moment, turning her cup in her hands, looking at the creek. "Fever," she said, 1881. I nodded. I didn't say I was sorry. She hadn't said it as an invitation for that. She'd said it the way you say a true thing that belongs in the air between two people, not to be comforted, just to be honest. "I lost a daughter," I said, 1882. She looked at me then. Not with pity, not with the particular careful attention people give you when they're about to say something sympathetic. Something more level than that. Like recognition, the way two people who have crossed the same bad country will look at each other when they find out. "How old was she?" 19. She nodded slowly, just nodded. Didn't say the things people say, the well-intended useless things. "At least she's at peace, at least she's with the Lord, at least you had those years." None of that. She just received it and let it sit there in the air between us and drank her coffee. I think that was the first time in 3 years that somebody had let it just be the size it was. Not tried to make it smaller or prettier or easier. Just let it be the thing it was, which was as big as everything. We finished the fence by 4 o'clock, and I loaded the tools, and she put the leftover biscuits in a cloth and handed them across to me without asking whether I wanted them, same as the first time. I drove home and ate 2 of them standing at the kitchen counter in the dark because I'd forgotten to light the lamp. It had been a decent day. That was the most I could have said for it, and I mean that plainly. Not a good day in the way you'd brag on it, nothing happened that would make a story. But decent was more than I'd had in a long while, and it had a slightly different texture than the days before it, and that was worth something. October came in cold and fast. We had an early snow that left 6 inches on the ground and killed the last grass, and I brought the herd in closer and spent a week on nothing but feeding and checking water, and cutting ice from the tank with a mattock, until my shoulders ached from the handle. Ollie and Sug were good workers and didn't need much from me in terms of direction, which was fortunate because I wasn't directing much. I was moving through the days like water moves through a blocked pipe, not with force, just finding whatever crack was available and seeping through it. The things I did and the things I didn't do were about equal. I did feed and water and check fence and pay the hands. I didn't cook a real meal more than once or twice a week. Didn't light a fire in the front room where it was warmer, used the kitchen stove and kept to that one room. Didn't write the letter I'd been meaning to write to Dora's sister in Ohio for about 6 months. Didn't look at the fiddle. On a Thursday, I rode the fence line just to have something to do with my legs, and when I came around the east corner, I could see the smoke from the Hennessy chimney across the flat, thin and straight in the still air. I sat on my horse and watched it for a minute. It was the kind of smoke that means a good fire going, steady and not hurried. She was inside doing whatever she did in the evenings, cooking or mending or reading, and there was a fire and she was warm. I rode home. I don't know what I was doing. I know I thought about her more than made sense for someone I'd worked alongside twice, but thinking about her wasn't what a younger man would have meant by it. It was more like she was a warm room in a cold house. You don't want to move in. You just find yourself thinking about the warmth, about the way she'd received what I said about Ellen without flinching, without managing it, without making it into something she could handle by saying the right things. About the dryness in her voice when she'd said she'd noted my mentioning, and how that had been the closest thing to laughter I'd made in months. That Friday she appeared at my gate. I was in the barn working on a harness that needed new stitching, the leather stiff and cold in my hands. I heard hoofbeats and came out, and there she was on a gray mare, looking down at me with something deliberate in her face. "One of your cows has a calf stuck in the creek bottom on my side," she said. "Other side of the east gate, she won't leave it." I didn't say anything, just went and saddled up and followed her. She led me along the fence to a place where a late-running section of creek had carved a small cutbank, and down in the soft mud there was a black calf about 3 weeks old, got its legs tangled in the roots of a drowned willow. The cow was standing in the water bellowing at it in that particular bovine distress that carries for half a mile. I waded in. The mud was cold enough to make you swear out loud, and I did quietly to myself. The calf was frightened and fighting, and every time I got a root loose it would thrash and tangle another leg, and the cow was crowding me from behind, and the water was coming over the tops of my boots. It took 20 minutes to untangle the root system enough to get the calf free, and by the time I dragged it to solid ground I was wet to the hip and covered in creek mud, and the calf was screaming, and the cow was screaming, and Margaret Hennessy was standing on the bank watching all of this with an expression that I could only describe as patient. I got the calf up the bank. It stood, shook, looked around with that blank, stunned look they get. The cow walked over and started working it over with her tongue, methodical and indifferent to my suffering. I stood in the cold, with mud drying stiff on my arms, and watched. "You want to come in and clean up," Margaret said. Not a question exactly. I looked at myself. The creek mud was going gray as it dried. I was wet and cold and smelled like the bottom of the Powder River. "I suppose I'd better," I said. I followed her to the house, and she put a basin of hot water on the stove, and I washed in the kitchen while she put the kettle on, and moved around me with the particular efficiency of someone who's lived alone long enough to use every inch of a small space. The kitchen was modest and had that quality that some kitchens have where everything in it is right where it belongs, not arranged, just settled, each thing worn into its place by use. There was a smell of bread that had been made that morning, warm even hours later. I was aware of my own kitchen when I thought of it, which had the smell of cold air and old ash and nothing living in it except me. She set a cup down in front of me and sat across the table. "You eat dinner at home," she said. "Usually." "What do you eat?" I thought about it honestly. Salt pork when I've got it, potatoes when I remember to buy them, biscuits if I've got the energy. She looked at me for a moment with something in her face that wasn't pity and wasn't quite concern, something more practical than either. "Stay," she said. "I'm not asking for." "I know you're not asking, I'm asking stay." There was no performance in it. She said it the same way she'd handed me the biscuits, not an offering that required my gratitude, just a plain thing that made sense, and she was making it. I stayed. She made a stew with dried beef and turnips and potatoes, and we ate at the small table, and she told me about St. Louis, the winters there that were cold but not like this cold, cold without the isolation. I told her about my first winter on the Powder, the winter of '74 when the snow came in October and didn't leave until April, and I lost 11 cattle and nearly the ranch itself, sleeping in the barn for warmth and eating what I could and counting the days by notches in a post. She listened the way she'd listened at the fence, fully, without planning her next comment while I was still talking, not managing the silence. When I left it was full dark and cold, and the sky was so clear you could see the Milky Way like flour spilled across a black cloth. I rode home slow and let the horse pick her own pace. I didn't sleep well that night, but the not sleeping was different from the usual kind. Usually when I lay awake it was because there was a hollow in me, a low-grade sound like wind through an empty barn, like something that should be there and wasn't, and the not being was audible. That night the sleeplessness had a different quality. Something more like the feeling of standing in a doorway. The room behind you is familiar and the outside is cold, but there's a light out there somewhere and you're thinking about walking toward it. I hadn't walked toward anything in 3 years. November. I started finding reasons to ride that way. Not every day, not even every week at first. But when the fence needed checking on the east side, I checked it instead of sending Ollie, and when I came back from town with supplies, I'd sometimes take the longer route that brought me past her gate. I told myself this was sensible. We shared a fence line. We were neighbors. It cost me 20 extra minutes. That was true and also not entirely the point. Twice she waved me in for coffee. Once she had a heifer that was having trouble with a first calf, and I stayed for an hour and a half working with the animal in the cold of the barn, and we got it right between us. And she bought 3 heifers and a young bull in October, so she was running cattle now, and she knew enough to know what she was watching but was glad for the extra pair of hands and said so plainly. I don't know what she made of me. I wasn't easy company, I knew that. Had always known it in a vague way, but knew it more clearly now that I was trying occasionally to be company at all. There were long silences I didn't fill, and there were moments when she'd say something ordinary and I'd be somewhere else inside myself, down in that hollow place, and I'd come back to find her waiting without impatience. She had a quality of patience that wasn't the kind that suffers through things. It was the kind that knows time takes time, that doesn't push the river. A few times that November I did something I hadn't done since before Dora died, which was notice a particular quality in the day. A morning with the frost on the dead grass making every stem silver. A sunset that went from orange to a deep red that lasted about 3 minutes and then was gone. The sound a frozen pond makes when the ice shifts, this low resonance like a note struck on something very large. I'd stopped noticing things like that sometime around the 2nd year after Ellen. Not on purpose. Things had just lost the particular quality that makes them worth noting. They were just things: grass, sky, ice, the sun going up and down. But in November I noticed things again, and I didn't know what to make of that except that something had shifted, some small degree of turning toward the world instead of away from it. I didn't say anything about it to anybody, partly because there was nobody to tell and partly because it seemed fragile. The way new ice is fragile. It will hold you, but you don't want to stomp around on it. What I will say is that the mornings were a little easier. Still early, still dark, still cold. But the getting up was not the same labor it had been. Sometimes I even made breakfast that was more than coffee and a cold biscuit. I am aware that making an egg is not a sign of great recovery, but it was something. We were coming into December when the real cold hit. I mean cold that has intention in it, that comes down from the north with a weight to it and stays. The creek froze hard and I spent 3 days with a mattock cutting water for the herd. Ollie got sick with something that went into his chest and I sent him to town to stay with his sister until it cleared. Sug was 14 and good but 14, and some of the harder work fell back on me and I didn't mind it. Work I could do. Work was the one reliable thing. On the 5th day of the cold, I was coming in from the north pasture on horseback, the sky the color of dirty tin, and the cold sharp enough to find the gap between my collar and my hat, and something happened that I'd felt once before and recognized. I don't know what to call it except that it comes without warning, and both times it came on me I was alone and in motion, doing something ordinary. The first time was 2 days after Ellen, when I was in the barn trying to mend a leather cinch and I just couldn't. My hands stopped working and I sat down on the floor with my back against a post and stared at the wall for 2 hours and couldn't tell you afterward what I was looking at. Not crying, not thinking. Just stopped, like an engine that's been running too hot and finally seizes. This time I was on my horse and I pulled up and sat there in the open with the frozen grass stretching out flat in every direction, and the cold going through my coat like it wasn't there, and I thought, this is it. This is all there is left of me. This work and this cold and then dark, and the dark coming faster than I'd thought because 3 years was going on 4 and I wasn't getting any less hollow. I was getting more, and I could put the work in and feed the animals and bank the fire at night, but there was nothing behind the motion, no reason for any of it that I could lay my hands on. Not suicidal thoughts. I want to be clear about that. Nothing so active as that. More like a recognizing. Like looking at an account ledger and understanding finally and completely that there is nothing left in it and the columns aren't going to change. I sat there for a long time. Long enough that my horse got impatient and started trying to turn for home on her own. I let her take me. I got inside and sat at the kitchen table and didn't light the lamp. The room went from gray to dark around me as the evening came in. The fiddle was on the workbench in the front room, visible in the remaining light through the doorway, the broken E string still on it, curled and loose where it had popped. 3 months. I hadn't touched it. I put my head down on my arms on the table. I'm not sure how long I stayed like that, long enough for the room to go fully dark. The cold came in under the door and the stove was down to coals. Somewhere outside Sug was feeding. I could hear the cattle moving and I didn't get up. I don't know what made Margaret Hennessy ride over that evening. She said later she didn't entirely know either. She'd been meaning to return a bolt of canvas I'd lent her in November, and the days had gotten away from her, and she'd looked up from her work in the late afternoon and thought, today, just that, today. She knocked. I didn't hear her at first. She knocked again, and then, because my horse was in the barn and smoke was coming from the chimney and my tracks were in the snow going in, she pushed the door open. I looked up from the table. The room was fully dark. She stood in the doorway with the outside cold at her back and the last gray light of the evening around her. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then she came in and shut the door and lit the lamp on the table. She found the matches by feel, on the shelf where people always keep matches, and I watched the light come up on the room and on her face, and she sat down across from me the same way she had at her own kitchen table that first night after the calf. No ceremony. No fuss, just sat. "When did you last eat?" she said. I thought about it honestly. Breakfast. "What did you eat?" "I don't remember." She got up and went to the kitchen. I heard her moving around in there, opening the cold box, striking a match for the stove, the solid sound of a pan going down. I didn't tell her not to. The kind of pride that would have done that had spent itself somewhere in the last 3 months, going out the same way the fiddle playing had gone, quietly and without announcement. She made eggs and fried potatoes and put them in front of me and sat back down while I ate. I ate because the smell was impossible to refuse, the particular smell of a hot pan, and salt that the body recognizes as necessary regardless of what the mind thinks it wants. She drank coffee and looked at the table and didn't watch me eat in the way that would have made me feel managed or pitied. When I finished, I pushed the plate away and we sat there in the lamplight. The stove was going now, the kitchen warming up around us. "You don't have to explain anything," she said. "Good," I said. "But I'm going to say something." "All right." She looked at her cup and then at me, direct and without softening it. "I've watched you this fall. I'm not talking about things I have a right to say. But I've watched you, and I think you've been going under for a long time, and I think maybe you've reached the bottom, and you're trying to decide whether to push off the floor and come up or just stay down." I didn't say anything. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," she said. "You've been alive longer than me and you've carried things I can't see, and I'm not going to give you a speech about what you should feel or how long you should take. But I'm going to tell you that the bottom is not the end. I know that to be true because I've been there. When I lost my boy and then Abel, I was there, stayed there a while, and I'm still here." She said it without drama or self-congratulation, just a fact offered as evidence. "I'm still here," she said again, quieter. The lamp made a small sound, the wick settling. Outside, the wind moved once through the eaves and then went quiet. "I'm tired," I said, the plainest truth I'd said to another person in years. "I know," she said. Not "I understand," not "I know how you feel," just "I know." And she meant it. She'd been at the bottom and she knew the particular exhaustion of it. She didn't say it would get better. She didn't say the Lord had a plan. She just said "I know" and stayed at the table. After a while she said, "Do you have anything tomorrow that can't wait?" I thought. Sug can handle the morning, water tanks and feeding. He knows the routine. All right, then let it wait. I'm not sure what she meant by that exactly, and I didn't ask. but something in me went quiet when she said it, like a rope that's been pulled too long and too hard being let down gently and the tension releasing from it, and the silence that comes after that. I wasn't better. I want to be clear about that too. I wasn't fixed, but I was slightly less at the bottom, and she was still sitting across the table, and the lamp was lit, and the eggs were warm in me, and for the first time in more months than I could count, the kitchen had the smell of something cooked in it that was real and warm. She came the next morning too. I hadn't expected that. I was up before first light, which was habit by now, had the stove going, was standing at the window with coffee watching the sky go from black to gray over the north pasture. I heard her horse at the gate. She came in with bread she'd made before she left home, still warm in the cloth, and she set it on the counter and started talking about the northeast corner of her fence line, where she thought 2 posts were going soft from the bottom, and we made a plan to look at it on Thursday if the cold broke a little. And she left after 20 minutes because she had her own cattle to see to. That was it. No ceremony. She just came and made it ordinary, treated me like a neighbor who could use a visit, not like a man who'd been sitting in the dark. And ordinary is what I'd been without. I hadn't known that was what I was missing until she started making some. She came again on Friday with a question about the best way to winter the heifers. I came to her place on Sunday to help move them into the barn paddock before a second cold snap hit. We developed a rhythm over December that was not romantic in the way people mean when they say that word, or not yet, or not in a way I was naming to myself. It was more like we'd both been navigating rough country alone for a long time, and we'd found that we navigated it better knowing the other one was out there. And then better still when we were out there at the same time. I started eating. Not because I decided to make a plan of it, but because she kept appearing with things, half a pie, an extra loaf, a pot of beans she said she'd made too much of, and it seemed wasteful not to. And then because my body remembered what it was like to be fed regularly and started asking for it. I started sleeping in the house again, second week of December. I moved back to the room I'd shared with Dora without announcing it to anyone or making a thing of it. I lay there the first night and waited for it to be unbearable, and it was just a room, cold and dark like any other room. I was tired. I slept. I didn't tell Margaret, she didn't ask. But something in how I was moving through the days must have shifted in some way she could see. Because one afternoon in the third week, she looked at me from across the fence we were repairing and said, "You look less like a dead man." "Thank you," I said. "I mean it as a compliment." I took it as one. She almost smiled. I'd learned by then that she smiled rarely, and that when she did, it happened in her eyes before it reached her mouth, a slight deepening of something that was always present. I'd become attentive to it without meaning to. The way you become attentive to a sound you've learned means something. Christmas Eve. I hadn't thought about Christmas in years. Let it pass like any other day, which it had been. But Margaret knocked on my door at 4 in the afternoon with a cloth-covered pot and the look of a woman who wasn't asking. "I didn't want to cook for one tonight," she said. She set the table. She'd brought everything. The pot was a venison roast she'd been slow cooking since that morning, and the smell of it came into the kitchen ahead of everything else. She'd brought dried apple preserves and the last of some summer corn she'd traded for in town, and she'd even brought a small candle in a jar that she set in the center of the table. We sat down, and she looked at the table in a considering way and said, "Should we say something?" I thought about what to say, about what I had that was worth saying. What came out was, "I'm glad you're here." She looked at me, "So am I." We ate. We talked more that evening than we had in all the months combined, not about the ranch or the fence or the cattle, but about other things, the kind of things you don't talk about with people you're not quite sure you trust yet. She told me about St. Louis and the school where she'd taught and the particular light Ohio had in spring, which was where she'd grown up, the way it came through new leaves and made everything look like it was lit from inside. I told her about my father's place in Tennessee and how I'd come west because the land here felt true to me, without apology and without trying to be something other than what it was. I told her about the winter I'd found the Powder River land, how I'd seen it from the back of a borrowed horse in November with the grass brown and the sky gray and nothing pretty about it at all, and known somehow it was mine before I'd even asked the price. She asked what had happened to the man I'd bought it from, and I told her. A fellow named Greer who'd come out from Pennsylvania and found out hard country didn't care about your intentions, lost 2 horses and most of his gear to a flood in his second spring, and gave up and went back east. She said she'd met a few men like that in her time in the territory, men who'd come west with the idea of the West rather than the actual thing. I said I had too, and that the actual thing had a way of sorting people out fast, and she said that was true of a lot of things besides geography, and we both knew she wasn't only talking about geography. We sat a while after the plates were clear. The candle was getting low. Neither of us moved to end the evening. At some point, I got up and put more wood on the stove, and when I came back she was looking at the fiddle. I'd moved it from the front room sometime in the last week, set it on the kitchen counter without quite knowing why, hadn't touched it but couldn't leave it out there. "You play," she said. I did. She looked at the broken E string, curled and loose on the tuning peg. "What does it need?" "Just the one string." "E string. Can you get one in town?" "Burfield's likely to have some. He keeps a few." She looked at me for a moment, not pushing, just looking. "Get one," she said. I looked at the fiddle, 3.5 months, the workbench, then the counter, like something I kept moving closer to myself without quite committing. "I've been told I'm not bad," I said. "I'll be the judge of that," she said. The candle was burning down in the jar, and the stove was hot, and outside it was snowing. One of those soft Christmas snows that comes down without wind and covers everything quiet. I could hear it happening by the way it wasn't making sound, that particular hush that only falls with certain snow. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. Not in a dramatic way, not with ceremony. She just put it there, palm down, steady and warm, and let it rest. I looked at our hands on the table. Her hand was not small. It was a working hand with short nails and a callus along the base of the fingers where the reins and the fence pliers had left their mark. "Callum," she said, my first name which she used rarely, "you're still here." I understood what she meant. Not the obvious thing, not just alive, not just breathing and moving through the days. Here, present in the room and in my own life in a way I had not been for 3 years. Whatever had been going out of me like a slow bleed had slowed, maybe stopped. I was still in the room. I turned my hand over under hers. She didn't move her hand away. Her fingers were warm and I held them. We sat like that for a while with the snow coming down soft outside and the candle burning lower in the jar and the stove breathing heat into the room. There was nothing dramatic about it. 2 people at a table with the dishes between them and the light going warm and low, holding hands like it was a thing they'd always done. I can't tell you everything that was in that moment. I can tell you it was the most I'd felt at home in 4 years, and that her hand was warm in mine, and that the fiddle on the counter was the first thing I saw when I looked up, and that I was already thinking about riding into town in the morning. I got the string on the 26th. Burfield at the Mercantile had 2 E strings left in a dusty cardboard box on a bottom shelf. He seemed surprised I wanted them, hadn't known I played. I paid him and rode home and sat at the kitchen counter and restrung the fiddle. It took 20 minutes because my fingers were stiff from the cold and the new string kept slipping on the peg. But I got it wound right, tightened it, plucked it with one finger. Then I drew the bow across all 4 strings. The sound that came out was thin and scratchy, cold wood, cold horsehair, a new string not yet settled. I sounded like a man who hadn't played in nearly 4 months, which I was. but it was a sound. A real one with body to it, with the particular resonance that a fiddle makes that you can feel in your chest if you're holding it right. I played for an hour. Badly. My calluses were mostly gone and my left hand kept cramping and I fumbled through things I'd known for 30 years like I was learning them new. The fiddle didn't care what I sounded like. It kept making sound. When I put it down, the quiet afterward was a different quiet than the quiet before. January. She came by on a Wednesday afternoon to check on the heifers wintering in my north barn. She'd asked if they could stay there since her paddock had poor wind cover, and I had the space. I was in the barn when she rode up and I heard her voice before I saw her, talking to the animals the way she did, low and level, as she walked the pen. I put down the pitchfork I was using and stood in the doorway and watched her. She was checking the feet on the smallest heifer, crouched down easy on her heels, one hand on the animal's flank. Her coat was brown and worn soft at the elbows. Her hair was loose today, tucked behind her ears and pushed back under her hat. There was nothing self-conscious about her. She moved through the world like she'd made peace with it. She looked up and saw me watching and stood. "Hooves are good," she said. "Good." She brushed her hands on her coat, looked at me. "You look different," she said, not as a compliment or a question, a plain observation. "Better or worse?" "Better," she paused, "like yourself, like somebody actually in there." I didn't know how to answer that. I'd almost forgotten what myself felt like, not the habits and the motions of myself, but the thing behind them. "I played the fiddle last night," I said. "How was it?" "Terrible." She laughed. The real one, the full one I'd only heard 3 or 4 times since October. It changed the whole quality of the cold barn. "Give it time," she said. "I expect to be terrible for a while," I said. "That's all right," she said. "I'll listen anyway." That was how she put it. Not a great speech about patience or devotion. Just, "I'll listen anyway." Standing there in the barn with hay in the cold air and the heifers moving in their pen and the pale flat light coming through the gaps in the siding. She meant more than the fiddle, and we both knew it, and neither of us needed to say so. February is when the cold on the powder gets serious about itself. Not the fresh cold of October that still smells like something ending. February cold has been at it for months, and it knows the country by now, knows where to find you. The sky stays the same dull slate for 2 and 3 weeks at a time. The cattle stand with their backs to the wind and look at you with that particular expression they get in deep winter, which is not accusation exactly but is not far from it. I worked, but I worked differently that February than I had the February before or the one before that. I noticed the work, the weight of the mattock when it bit ice, the sound the frozen creek made when it gave way, the particular warmth that comes into your hands from a long tool handle. I noticed Sug, who was turning into a good hand faster than he knew. He'd figured out the lead heifer and could move the small herd just by positioning himself right, and one afternoon he'd solved a problem with a stuck gate that had taken me 10 minutes of fighting, and he'd seen it and fixed it in half the time. I told him so. He looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language. I suppose I had, coming from me. I didn't think I'd made a habit of telling people when they'd done something right. Margaret came for dinner twice in February. I cooked the second time. Nothing ambitious. I'd asked Ollie's sister what to do with a piece of salt pork and some dried peppers, and she'd told me and I'd followed it mostly right, and Margaret ate it without making a performance out of how good it was. She just ate it and said that was good and meant it, and that was the right response. Afterward, I got out the fiddle and played while she sat at the table with her coffee. I was better than January, the calluses coming back, the hand loosening up. I played the old songs I'd always played, the ones from when I was young and my father played alongside me, and I played an Irish reel I'd learned from a Galway man in a Cheyenne saloon in 1871, who played like his life depended on it. And I played the slow, nameless one I'd been playing since I was 20 that always sounded to me like standing in a doorway looking out at distance. When I stopped, she said, "What's that last one called?" "I don't know. I never knew the name. Learned it from a man on a cattle drive, 1869, never saw him again." "It sounds like something ending well," she said. I looked at the fiddle in my lap. The new E string had settled into the instrument now, and the sound was fuller than when I'd first put it on. "Yeah," I said. "I think that's probably what it is." She was looking at me when I looked up. That thing in her eyes that I'd learned to read, the particular deepening of attention that came before her smile, but this time without the smile following it, just the attention itself. Like being seen clearly, without addition or subtraction. After years of moving through the world like a man made of shadow, like a man nobody could get a hold on, she just looked at me and I was there. I put the fiddle down on the table. "Margaret," I said. "Yes. I'd like it if you'd stay." The question inside those words was larger than the words, and she heard the size of it. She didn't look away. Didn't reach for qualifications or conditions or careful language about what she could and couldn't promise. She said, "I know, I've been thinking the same thing." Outside the wind had laid down and the night was still and very cold, the kind of cold that makes the stars look hard and permanent, like they're nailed up there. The stove settled. The fiddle lay between us on the table. She reached across and covered my hand with hers, same as Christmas Eve. And this time I turned my hand over and she closed her fingers and held on, and I held back. We were married in April, when the ground had softened, and the cottonwoods along the creek were coming into first leaf. Small ceremony, Ollie and Sugg, the Burfields from town, the circuit preacher who came through once a month and was a decent man without too much preamble to him. Margaret wore a blue dress she'd kept from St. Louis. It was the first time I'd seen her in anything that wasn't work clothes, and the blue suited her and she looked herself. Entirely herself, which was the best she could have looked. The preacher said what preachers say, the words that have been said 1,000 times and still mean something when they're said at the right time and to the right people. We said what we were asked to say. Then Ollie shook my hand with the particular warmth of a man who's been watching you come back to yourself and is glad about it. And Sugg stood there with his hat in his hands, not sure what to do with his face. And Mrs. Burfield cried a little, which I hadn't expected. We drove home in the wagon along the creek road with the new cottonwood leaves making that pale green that only lasts about a week in April and always arrives and leaves faster than you expect. She sat beside me on the seat, and the road was rutted from the spring thaw and we rocked along in silence for a stretch. Then she put her hand on my arm, just rested it there, and left it there the rest of the way home. At home I unhitched the team and put them up and cleaned the tack, and by the time I came in she had supper going and the table set. Wednesday evening in April, just supper, just the two of us, the same as it had been all winter except now it was permanent, and the permanence was in the room in a way that didn't feel heavy. It felt like a thing that had settled into its right place. The fiddle was on the counter where it lived now. I got it down and played while she finished supper. The slow, nameless one, the one she said sounded like something ending well. I played it through twice, still a little rough in the middle where the fingering was complicated, getting better each time. The tone was good. The new string had been on for months now and had fully become part of the instrument, indistinguishable from the others. "You're getting there," she said from the stove. "Give me another month." "Give yourself 2, she said. "Don't rush it." I played it again. The evening light was coming through the kitchen window at the low April angle, doing what evening light does in that month, turning everything the particular amber that makes a plain room look like a room worth having. Her shadow moved across the wall as she moved at the stove. The smell of supper was in the room, and the lamp was lit against the coming dark, and the fiddle was warm in my hands. I was 61 years old, and I had grieved as deeply as a man can grieve and spent 3 years going under by degrees, and come out the other side of it with something I hadn't planned on and didn't entirely know I'd needed, which is maybe the best way to receive a thing that is genuinely good. Not having seen it coming, not having designed it or earned it through any plan, just having it arrive the way rain arrives, when the ground is dry enough to need it. She set a plate at my place and looked across the table at me. The look I knew. The one that saw me clearly and without revision, the thing I'd spent years being invisible, and then years being a shadow of myself, and then one winter learning again to be a man who was actually in the room. I put the fiddle on the counter and pulled back my chair and sat down. Outside, the cottonwoods were in that first pale green, and the evening was long and soft the way April evenings are, like the light is reluctant to go. There was a good woman across the table from me, and supper between us and the fiddle on the counter with all 4 strings whole. That's the way I tell it to myself when I think about it now. The fiddle with all 4 strings whole. Some things you don't need more words for than that.